Hi everyone, welcome to the topic of sewing the doll size quilt. We're kicking off this topic in March, which is National Quilt Month, and I thought it would be the perfect time to sew a doll size quilt together. I mean, seriously, what could be cuter than a doll size quilt? So over the course of this topic, I'm really excited to walk you through the process of doll scale quilting while making the Lily Stone Tropical Illusion quilt together. In part one, we'll go over the basic supplies needed, fabric choices, and begin cutting and sewing all of our strips. We'll also take a look at the two variations included in the pattern. There is an easy variation and an intermediate level variation. The tutorial is going to focus on the intermediate level, but it will also touch on the simplified methods included in sewing the easier variation. In part two, we'll cut apart the strips into blocks and then into tiny triangles to create the quilt top design. In part three, we'll go over the quilting process and finish it all up with the borders and the binding. Then in part four, we're going to have a lot of fun bringing it to life, set up as a complete doll room. So we will complement the quilt with sheets, pillows, PJs, and of course, those cute little felt dolls and animals. So let's jump on in and get started. To make the Tropical Illusion quilt, you will need 4 quilting cotton fabrics in coordinating prints and possibly a 5th if you want your backing fabric to be different than the 4 you've chosen for the top. You'll also need batting, a thin layer, it's an 18 by 24 inch piece, pins, thread, hand sewing needle, rotary cutter in your preferred size. I have a 45 millimeter and an 18 millimeter for tiny pieces, acrylic ruler, cutting mat, scissors, all the pressing tools, an iron, ironing board, spray bottle, or steam in your iron. And then if desired, you can have some quilter's tape, 1/8 inch or quarter inch, just to help hold the pieces together. Once you have your fabrics picked out, I encourage you to use the diagram and the numbers and really just think through how you want your fabrics to lay out in that design. It's also going to help you determine how much fabric you need for all of them. The ones that you use on the border are going to end up needing more fabric. So what we've done here is we have a piece of paper numbered 1, 2, 3, 4. And then on the diagram itself, we've gone in and numbered the different colors according to the first page of the instruction of the patterns where it's talking about calling the colors a number. So once you translate your chosen colors into the numbers, it makes it easier going through the rest of the pattern if you have a sheet like this next to you. So what we've decided right here is that for fabrics 1 and 2, we're going to be just cutting the 1 inch strips. And then for the fabrics 3 and 4, we're going to cut the 1 inch strips, but we're also going to cut the border and the outer border out of these two fabrics. So the measurements on the pattern instructions that have the larger amounts, just make sure that we have enough of those. Then for our design, we've also decided to use fabric number 4 as our backing, which is a pretty good size, 5/8 recommended amount of fabric. So we just want to make sure that you have enough for all of it before you start cutting your strips. And then I'll note quickly that for the other variation, it has solid borders around the edge. It doesn't use the striped piecing. So on that one, you're going to want to look at the fabric requirement for the extra fabric needed for that third border section. First, you're going to want to cut the 4 fabrics into the 1 inch strips. You need 6 strips for each color if you're cutting across the full yardage of the 42 to 44 inch wide fabric. So go ahead and cut 6 1 inch strips of fabric 1, 6 1 inch strips of fabric 2, 6 1 inch strips of fabric 3, and 6 1 inch strips of fabric 4. Then using fabric 3, you're going to cut 2 1.5 inch strips that will be used as border number 2. And then of fabric number 4, you're also going to cut 2 additional 1 inch strips for border number 1. And then of that fabric number 4, again, you'll cut 2 2 inch strips for binding. And here you can see all of the pieces mentioned cut, and some of them have already been sewn. So I have the loose strips here in the middle. These are fabrics 1, 2, 3, and 4. I have my backing Over here, I've got the border fabrics and the binding fabric, which is the widest strip. And then here you can see we have 2 of these strips already sewn. So let's take a look at how to sew the strips together. First, you're going to want to decide which variation you're sewing, the intermediate or the easy. The intermediate version sews the strips together in a repeating order. The easy variation sews the strips together in a mirrored order. For this demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and show you sewing together the strips for the intermediate version. So I have spread out in front of me all 8 strips. I have fabric 1, fabric 2, fabric 3, fabric 4, and then repeating again 1, 2, 3, 4. So we're going to sew these together, right sides together, one at a time until we have a complete section of 8 strips. First, you're going to sew number 2 to number 4 along the long edge. Be precise when sewing your 1/4 inch seam allowance for every single strip. This is going to be a huge part of consistency for the overall project. If your seam allowances are off, your overall size of your strip will not be consistent and it'll be hard to cut them into even 4.5 inch squares. Once your strip is sewn, you're going to want to press the seams to one side. Then you're going to take fabric number 3 and sew it to fabric number 4 from the first 2 that are sewn together. Sew the whole length 1/4 inch seam, then press your seam in the same direction as the first seam allowance was pressed. Then you'll continue with fabric number 1, sewing it to fabric number 3. Then go ahead and press your seam allowance in the direction of all the prior seam allowances. Then you'll repeat the pattern number 2 to number 4 to number 3 to number 1, pressing all the seam allowances as you go, and then the completed strip set should have 8 rows and it should measure 4.5 inches wide. Then you'll repeat this process for the other 2 sets of strips. So now we've done a lot of work and you've done a lot of sewing. We're going to take a short little break and then we're going to pick up again in part 2, cutting all of the blocks.